This episode is sponsored by Magisterium AI, the world's #1 AI-powered guide to church teaching. Query our knowledge base of over 9,000 magisterial and Catholic theological texts and discover how AI is supercharging access to church teaching.
Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, the editor of Crux, and your host here on Last Week in the Church. This is the show where we talk shop about the Vatican and the global Catholic Church. This week, we've got an especially savory menu for you, so let's dive right in to set the table. We begin with the Pope in Ukraine. Breaking with the leadership of his own Catholic Church in Ukraine, Pope Francis on Sunday criticized a new law banning activities of the Russian Orthodox Church in the country. We'll explain what he said and how it fits into the broader context. Second, keeping a Biden moment at bay. Pope Francis is getting set to launch a 4-nation, 11-day odyssey into Asia and Oceania. At a root level, one question is, why? What's he doing? We're going to explain that part of the answer is to show that he can. Third, this week, we've got a bill comes due. The founder of a scandal-plagued ecclesial movement in Peru is expelled from the movement he actually founded by Vatican decree. We'll explain what happened and try to handicap the debate over what all this means going forward. Fourth, we've got the devil is in the dialogue. Pope Francis is about to travel the world in search of conversation partners. Meanwhile, employees here in the Vatican itself are wondering, is he ever going to talk to us? We'll explain what they would like to discuss with the Holy Father and what implications it might have for Vatican operations going forward. And then finally, we've got the trouble with Nigeria. How Nigerian Christians are sounding an alarm, not merely over a worrying pattern of attacks on Christian targets, that, alas, is old news, but the new development is concerned that the army and security forces might actually be complicit in this pattern of anti-Christian persecution. We'll explain what they're saying and why. All that and more is waiting for you on this edition of Last Week in the Church. So please, for the love of God, I have thought long and hard about this. This is good stuff. Don't go anywhere. I will be right back. All right, everybody, happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, August 27th, in the sweltering year of our Lord 2024. I hope wherever you are enjoying a great summer, a great August. We were, of course, off last week because my wife, Elise, and I were on vacation. So this isn't so much last week in the church as it is last fortnight in the church, but that simply means we have more stuff to talk about. So let's get started. We begin with something that didn't happen 2 weeks ago, actually just happened 2 days ago. During his traditional noontime Sunday Angelus address, Pope Francis took an unusually pointed and unusually specific position on the internal politics of a particular country. He addressed a new law that was recently adopted in Ukraine. It was actually passed by the Ukrainian parliament in an overwhelming vote, 256 to 29, on August 20th, signed into law by the head of the Ukrainian parliament on the 23rd, and then by President Vladimir Zelensky on August 24th. It's Law 8371, to be precise, and essentially what it does is that it bans activities of any church group in Ukraine that is part of the Russian Orthodox Church, that is, that has links to Moscow. Now, this has been described as a necessary self-defense measure by its proponents in Ukraine and an expression of Ukrainian independence, that is, its refusal to become a vassal state of Russia. On the other hand, it has been described as an assault on religious freedom by its critics. And the ranks of those critics were joined on Sunday by Pope Francis, who said that while he continues to be very concerned about the situation in Ukraine, he also notes with alarm and concern this new legislation on the status of churches. He said that Everybody should have the freedom to pray as he or she wishes. There should be no restrictions on the ability to pray in the church of your choice. And he concluded with a strong rallying cry, which is hands off the churches. Do not mess with churches. Leave them alone. This was widely seen as criticism of the new Ukrainian measure. Two things are of immediate interest about this. One, it came just 24 hours after Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, had issued a public letter appealing to the Pope and other global religious leaders to speak out against the Ukrainian law. Therefore, the Pope's statement will be seen as a direct response to the request of the head of the Russian Orthodox Church to come into this debate on his side. Secondly, the Pope's comments came just a few days after the head of the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine, that's the largest of the 23 Eastern Catholic churches in full communion with Rome, Major Archbishop Sviatoslav Shevchuk, came out in favor of this new Ukrainian law, saying it is a necessary measure because the Russians, he said, have militarized religion. They have turned it into what he called a neurotropic weapon, that is, a weapon that attacks the central nervous system. And he said, therefore, this law is not an assault on religious freedom. It is a necessary measure of self-defense, and it is needed to ensure that religion is not turned into an instrument of war. I mean, in effect, it is a bit like the argument that Israelis make for military incursions at, say, hospitals or schools in the Gaza Strip. Their argument is that if Hamas turns hospitals and schools into fronts for terrorist activity, then the military has no option other than to go after them while trying to be as respectful and protective of civilian populations as possible. That was, in a sense, a kind of analog to the argument that Shevchuk and other Christian leaders in Ukraine have made. Now, the bottom line here is, however you parse it, this is going to be seen by Ukrainians themselves. And by the way, it should be said that the Ukrainian embassy to the Holy See, in the immediate aftermath of this papal statement on Sunday, responded to requests from reporters for comment by saying, essentially, the Pope is wrong. That he said you shouldn't interfere with somebody's ability to pray. The Ukrainian embassy said this doesn't affect anybody's ability to pray in their own home any way they want to. It just restricts the corporate activity of churches that are being used as fronts by Moscow to advance its own political, strategic, and military objectives. So anyway, this is going to be seen as another chapter of the Vatican taking a somewhat different line on the conflict in Ukraine than the Christian leadership, including the Catholic leadership in Ukraine itself, is taking. You know, how that is going to play out is anyone's guess. It should be said, of course, that Pope Francis has this ambition of repositioning the Vatican away from its traditional identity as a kind of artifact of Western culture into being a much more globalist and truly non-aligned entity on the world stage. And his desire to strike a balance between humanitarian sympathy for Ukraine, but also strategic, if you like, geopolitical openness to the concerns of Russia, that is of a piece with that broader objective. Now, where that is going to leave him with his own flock, including his own flock in Ukraine, that remains to be seen. It's part of the drama of this story, and obviously on the Crux site, we will continue to track it. All right, second up this week, we've got keeping his Biden moment at bay. You know, ladies and gentlemen, in the course of human affairs, it is very rare that you can date with precision when a particular leader's political career ended. But when it comes to U.S. President Joe Biden, we can actually do that. It was the evening of June 27, 2024, when President Biden stepped onto a stage in Atlanta, Georgia, to debate former President Donald Trump. And his stumbling, confused, at times even seemingly disoriented performance that night created a tidal wave of energy within the Democratic Party that eventually proved irresistible, that led to Biden stepping aside and passing the torch, of course, to Vice President Kamala Harris, who is now leading the Democratic charge against Trump in the November elections. This Biden moment, in other words, and by the way, let's be clear, there was never any vote that said that Joe Biden had to step aside. There wasn't a plebiscite. The momentum simply became irresistible because Biden's own base, people who admired him deeply, who had voted for him in 2020, and who under other circumstances would have been prepared to do so again, that base simply lost confidence in his capacity to lead. That base decided he no longer had the wherewithal, he no longer had the chops, the energy, the acumen, the focus in order to be able to lead the party and the country forward. Now, Biden is 81. You know who else is in his 80s and still occupying a leadership role on the global stage? It is, of course, the 87-year-old Pope Francis, who, in under a week now, is getting prepared to set sail for the four corners of the earth. He is going to be leaving Rome the morning of September 2nd to travel first to Indonesia. He will then visit East Timor, Papua New Guinea, and Singapore before he returns to Rome on the 13th of September. It is destined to be the longest and, in some ways, most arduous journey of his papacy. Now, there are several questions one could ask, of course, but one question to be asked is, why is the Pope doing this? I mean, let us recall, first of all, that he is still suffering from multiple health challenges. He has had several intestinal surgeries. He is, of course, from a bout of pneumonia as a young man, missing part of one lung. He has chronic respiratory difficulties. He has sciatica that makes it difficult to sit or stand in one position for very long. He has chronic arthritis of the knee, which means he's mostly restricted to use of a wheelchair. Just 2 years ago, in an interview with Mexican television in 2022, he basically said, I don't think I can make long international trips anymore. He said, we're going to have to curtail the way I travel. I'm going to have to rethink all of this. And yet, here he is, taking what is in most ways the most ambitious voyage of his entire papacy. Why? Well, I mean, look, there's logic for each stop along the way. Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim country, and it also casts a spotlight on the fact that although we in the West tend to think of Islam through the prism of Arab culture, only 1/4 of the 1.9 billion Muslims in the world are actually Arabs. The center of gravity of Islam in many ways today is in Asia. Most would say that the form of Islam that has grown up in Asia is less radical, more tolerant, more open to dialogue. This trip allows Pope Francis to engage that Asian Islam directly. In East Timor, a country where 97% of the population, of a little over 1 million people, is officially Catholic, he has the opportunity, obviously, to play pastor to a small but important Catholic flock in an overwhelmingly non-Catholic, non-Christian part of the world. In Papua New Guinea, he is visiting one of the most peripheral missionary outposts in the world. And in Singapore, he's visiting one of the world's financial powerhouses and also an important conduit of conversation with China, bringing us back to his broader geopolitical agenda, right? So there's logic for every stop. But deeper than that, I think it could be said that the Pope also is simply determined to show that he still can do this. That despite the challenges he is facing, he is still fully mentally engaged, and that his physical issues, while annoying and limiting, do not prevent him from making himself physically present to the world. In other words, he is trying to show you, ladies and gentlemen, that his Biden moment is that moment when it becomes clear that he can no longer do the job. Whenever it might come, it ain't today. He's trying to show you that right now, there is still gas left in the tank and he is still good to go. Recently, my wife and I caught up with a Vatican official who occasionally has some FaceTime with the Pope. who came out of this meeting telling us, this is not a pope who has any intention of dying anytime soon. I think this trip is his way of putting an exclamation point on that claim. Obviously, we will see how it goes. My wife Elise, by the way, will be on the papal plane for this trip. She will have full, saturation, comprehensive, intelligent, erudite, insightful, and unparalleled coverage into this voyage, so please do be tracking the Crux site for that. Speaking of my wife Elise, another story she has been on top of since the very beginning are the vicissitudes of a ecclesial movement in Peru known as the Sodalitium Christianae Vitae. That's Latin for the sodality of Christian life. This is a movement that was founded in 1971 by a Peruvian layman by the name of Luis Fernando Figari, and it went on to become, by far, the largest ecclesiastical movement in Peru, one of the largest in Latin America, and one of the most important, really, in the Catholic world. It became the kind of nerve center of a cluster of other groups, so there's also a group of consecrated lay women, there's a group of religious women, there's a lay group, all of them inspired by the same charism and spirituality bequeathed to this cluster of activity by Figari many years ago. Figari is now 77, living in exile. So, a number of years ago, so we're talking about the early 2000s, charges of abuse against Figari began to circulate. And, the phenomenology of all of this is now familiar. Originally, these were sort of seemingly isolated complaints, one-off things, quickly dismissed by the leadership of the sodality and by other church officials as, attacks on the church or misunderstandings or whatever. The complaints continued to accumulate. Eventually, it became impossible to ignore them, so an investigation was launched. All this sort of reached a preliminary crescendo in 2017 when the Vatican imposed a series of restrictions on Figari, basically banning him from public activity, which at the time was seen as tantamount to a recognition that at least some of these charges were correct, were true. That triggered an internal reform process within the various groups that Figari had founded. Their constitutions were supposed to be overhauled, the leadership changed, various watchers and overseers were appointed, so forth and so on. This brings us to the last couple of weeks, when after a decade-long investigation, which of late has been spearheaded by the Vatican's untouchables, their equivalent of Elliot Ness, right? That is Maltese Archbishop Charles Scicluna, and Spanish, well, really Catalonian, but who's counting, Monsignor Jordi Bertolomeu, who are the Pope's 007s, right? They're his lead investigators on all matters of abuse. So they have had their hands around this thing with the sodality. And all of this culminated in a decree from the Vatican's department that deals with religious societies and so on, essentially ordering Figari expelled from the Society of Christian Life. And so he is no longer part of it. The organization actually welcomed this decision, saying that it had asked for it as far back as 2019, and described this as an act of charity, justice, and reconciliation for Figari's victims. It should be said that the organization officially has recognized at least 66 individuals it believes were abused either by Figari or others in the organization, and also created a compensation fund of a little under $3 million to try to help victims out. Now, by the way, it should also be said that this is not the end of the story, because, as Elise has reported, there are other members of the organization who have received letters from the Vatican indicating that they too are under investigation and may be subject to punitive measures. There also continue to be persistent rumors that the sodality itself might be suppressed by papal edict. We, of course, don't know that, but there continues to be speculation, at least, that that might be in the offing. Now, the question to be asked, aside from the effects on Figare, which, to be quite honest with you, are fairly nominal. As I said, Figare is 77 years old. He hasn't had any role in the SCV for some time now. According to reports, he is living in exile in San Giovanni Rotondo, which is the big shrine of Padre Pio here in southern Italy. And so, in a sense, this disciplinary act is more symbolic than substantive, although I think, many victims would say that nevertheless it did bring them a sense of, vindication, because it kind of says out loud that their claims were not attacks on the church, they weren't made up, but there was reality to them. So there is importance to that, of course. But substantively, it probably doesn't change the calculus a great deal. So the question is, what does this tell us about the state of the reform effort with regard to the abuse scandals in the church? Well, as ever, ladies and gentlemen, depends on who you ask. There is a glass half full reading and a glass half empty. The glass half full would say that the SCV, the sodality, has turned over a new leaf, that in the old days it defended Figare to the teeth, it attacked victims, and basically engaged in a kind of circle the wagons exercise in defensiveness and denial. Now they are openly welcoming this decision. They are encouraging victims to reach out and tell their stories. They're undergoing a process of reform, and they have said that Figare, even though he is their founder, he is no longer a point of reference for their spirituality going forward. So the glass half full reading would be, this is an organization struggling to turn over a new leaf and responding well to the measures the Vatican is imposing. Now, what critics will tell you, on the other hand, is this is all a con game, that in reality, the people calling the shots inside the SCV today are pretty much the same people once upon a time who were defending Figare. They have simply adopted a new rhetoric, and what they're attempting to do is unload all the blame onto Figare personally to absolve themselves and the rest of the group from any kind of responsibility. So trying to say this is an individual problem, not a corporate problem. In other words, giving them license to continue business as usual. Now, which one of those two ratings is correct, or which combination of those two ratings is correct, will have to be determined going forward. One promise I can make you, we will continue to pay close attention on the Crux site. All right, fourth up this week, we've got the devil is in the dialogue. So, as we've already mentioned, Pope Francis is about to, travel the highways and byways of the world to find people to engage in dialogue. He's going to be talking to Islamic leaders in Indonesia. He'll be talking to far-flung members of his own Catholic flock in East Timor. He'll be talking to missionaries and indigenous persons in Papua New Guinea, and he'll be talking to the captains of industry and finance while he's in Singapore. And that's all great. I mean, a pope, Pontifex Maximus, right? Bridge builder, should be talking to people. It's a wonderful thing. The question is, who is he not talking to? And I can supply one group right now that definitely feels like the Pope is turning a deaf ear, and that is his own labor force here in the Vatican. Recently, the Association of Lay Employees in the Vatican, which is the closest thing the Vatican has to a labor union, and when I say recently, I'm talking August 20th, put out a statement basically saying, hey, you're talking to the whole world. How about talking to us? Because we've got some stuff we would like to talk about. Specifically, they said there is a rising tide of discontent, lack of morale, confusion, and alarm among the people who work directly in the name of and on behalf of the Pope. They cited 5 specific concerns. First, they said, as part of the Pope's financial reforms, a whole series of cost-cutting measures have been imposed on Vatican employees. This includes a suspension of seniority-related pay raises, a freeze on hiring, freeze on promotions, so forth and so on. They said, but we have no idea if these measures, which we have been paying for, we have no idea if they're actually working because the Vatican has not put out an actual financial statement for years. So there is no way of knowing if the sacrifices we're being asked to make are actually accomplishing anything. Second, they noted that there are certain exceptions being made to these belt-tightening measures, that there are certain people who have been given promotions to leadership positions, and they said this isn't always based on merit, at least as far as we can see. Third, they said other reforms, such as raising the rents on Vatican apartments to better reflect market values, negatively affects employees who live in those apartments whose incomes have been frozen at 2008 levels, but who are now being asked to pay more in rent. Fourth, they noted that a lot of labor in the Vatican is being outsourced these days, so the Vatican's own workforce is being cashiered in order to facilitate this outsourcing. And fifth, most basically, they said, every time we raise these concerns, no one wants to talk to us about them. We can't get meetings. Superiors won't even, make 5 minutes to sit down and hammer any of these issues out. Point? I think there are a lot of these worker bees in the Vatican who think that while it may be cool the Pope is out there engaging the wider world in conversation, they'd like to have a bite at the apple themselves. Finally this week, and we're running out of time, but just very quickly, I would encourage you to go on the Crux site and find the reporting of Nagala Kilian Chimtam, our correspondent in Africa, on what's going on in Nigeria. We all know that Nigeria has been a hotbed of anti-Christian persecution for the last couple of decades, really since the rise of Boko Haram in 2009. There were problems before, but it has certainly intensified. The new twist here is it isn't simply wildcat, jihadist organizations on the ground, but there are increasing concerns among Christians in Nigeria that the country's own military and security services may be complicit in all of this. The perception is the military is dominated by the Muslim-led north of the country. The command structure of the military is sometimes in league with Islamist elements in Nigerian society. Recently, there were military raids on 3 Catholic parishes in the south of Nigeria, which were justified as part of a manhunt for terrorists who had attacked a military base, killing 2 soldiers, but which had been seen by many Christian activists simply as a pretext for cracking down on, in this case, Catholic churches, but not just, because there was also an Anglican parish and some Pentecostal churches that were also attacked. But attacking Christian targets that are seen as important organisms in civil society, providing space for dissident voices from the regime to be heard. This is if true, this would obviously mark a deeply worrying escalation in terms of state sponsorship of what amounts to explicit anti-Christian persecution. And let's remember, Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa. It has the world's largest mixed Muslim-Christian population. It is a bellwether and a pace-setter for the Southern Hemisphere and really for the entire world as we move deeper into the 21st century. In other words, when Nigeria sneezes, the rest of us increasingly are going to catch cold. We ought to be paying attention. All right, that is our show for this week, ladies and gentlemen. You can find full coverage of all of these stories and much, much more on the Crux site. That is cruxnow.com, your one-stop shopping destination for the very best in smart, wired, and independent Catholic journalism. Do be paying attention next week as my wife sets sail with Pope Francis for this 4-nation Asian and Oceanic Odyssey. We'll have full coverage, and we'll have full coverage of everything else going on in the Catholic world. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, have a fantastic and blessed week, and we will talk to you here again, same bat time, same bat channel, very, very soon.